one more session to go. I do appreciate your patience, perseverance, sticking with it to the end. We're going to talk about modern Christianity, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to skip these discussion questions and get us right into it, and we'll wrap up our day. A few movements to talk about here. First is the missions movement. And of course, the reason there is a missions movement in the way we think of missions, as in we do ministry to those around us here and we do missions to those out there, is because at this time in history, the world has discovered all those other continents out there, all those people groups out there who have not been evangelized. So with exploration came evangelization and the missions movement. I had a picture here of a famous painting by Salvador Dali, who's not a great example of Christian art, Christian theology, but this is the Discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, and you see on his sails a cross, and it's hard to make out because it's fuzzy, but there are countless lines of more ships and people with crosses coming to America, and this is the triumph of Christianity over Latin America. We ought to be careful, as we talk about the history of Christian missions, to admit that too often the idea of Christianization and trying to civilize a people went too much hand in glove. And so the purpose of missionaries being brought was to simply domesticate the natives. Or sometimes the idea of what it means to be Christian is to take natives and make them look like Europeans, because we're a Christian civilization. So we have to admit that there was the dark side of missions movement with exploration. But because of this exploration, we brought about a lot of new adventures in Christianity. So I'll talk a bit about the Jesuits just as further background. There is Ignatius Loyola. And Ignatius Loyola is going to lead a group called the Society of Jesus, or we call them Jesuits. And Ignatius was first a soldier, and then he seemed to bring this soldier mentality, this conquest mentality, into missions. He's working for the Roman Catholic Church. They swore an allegiance to do whatever the Pope says and go wherever the Pope says to go. And so we have to credit them. They did much great work. I mentioned they go to India, they go to the far West Indies, they go to China, and they go to places where the gospel had rarely, if ever, been, and they are translating the Bible for peoples, and they are bringing Christ to these areas. Pretty soon, the Protestants get on board with this. I mentioned a group of pietists just at the end of last session. The Moravians is a group from what is now the modern-day Czech Republic, and they're led by Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. And I'm not going to ask you to spell Zinzendorf on the test, but I've given it there for you. Zinzendorf found this group of pietists. They wanted to hold their prayer services on his land, and he allowed them. And he was so inspired by them, he ended up becoming one of their leaders. And so he had a heart to take the gospel out to all these continents and countries that had never been Christianized before. But to do so, he decided that we better have a prayer service. So in 1727, he began this prayer service and asked for people to commit to 1 hour of prayer. And if you can't commit to this hour of prayer, come the next hour. And if you can't come to that hour, come to the hour after that. And eventually, so many people committed to this that they had around-the-clock prayer going, all praying that God would send workers out into the harvest. And this group prayed around the clock 24/7 for 5 solid years before the first 2 missionaries were finally able to be sent in 1732. And then after them, hundreds and hundreds, that's no exaggeration, of missionaries went out into the world spreading the gospel. And these are Protestant groups taking the gospel of Jesus Christ to all sorts of places around the world. I've got a picture there for you of Zinzendorf, and this is Zinzendorf on the right with the light of God shining down into his heart, because you too should have your heart strangely warmed. It's not just enough that you were baptized. It's a personal experience of salvation. And if you can make out all the peoples and faces, they represent very different people groups and continents, and all the people Zinzendorf, in effect, preached to, even though he never left Moravia. It was the other people that he sent out. All right, we'll also talk about mission societies. And there were all sorts of societies taking place. There was a mission society that sent out John Eliot. He's called the Apostle to the Indians because he leaves his cushy life in England and goes as a Puritan to the New World. I won't go into all of these societies, but the brilliance of this is instead of one church, like Zinzendorf's church, coming up with the money to send people out and all the resources it takes to send people out, your small Baptist church under Thomas Helwys and another small Baptist church down the road in London and other Baptist churches around England can all form one society and pool their money together. And even though your church may only give a little and that church may only give a little, together we make a lot, and we can begin to send out many, many missions around the world. The Baptist Missionary Society sent out William Carey. And William Carey is called the father of modern missions. He's one of our Baptist ancestors we can be proud of. He goes to India, and he really sets the blueprint for how to do missions. He thought he was going to get there and preach the good news to the Indians from India, and they would all say, oh, that's the true God, and worship Christ, and they would come in droves to Christianity. They did not. But he still preached faithfully. It took 7 years of faithful preaching before he had his first convert. In the meanwhile, even though he continued to preach the gospel faithfully, most of his work was working with what are called the untouchables, the lower caste systems. He also continued to work with Bible translation because he knew that the Indians deserved to hear the Bible in their own language. And so this idea of going publicly proclaiming the faith and calling for converts, also working in society to bring about good for the lowest caste, the least of these, and translating the Bible. Those are the key ideas in the modern missions movement, and this is something you can do when funded by a missions society. So even if you don't have a church in India, your mission society back home still supports you, and while you take the time it takes to lay all the groundwork to do missions wherever you go. So he's the father of modern missions. I mentioned now just the one thing, the International Missions Conference was founded in 1910, and this was a unique adventure because this wasn't just a group of Baptist churches pooling their money together, and there were others. There were all sorts of Puritan groups pooling their money together, and the Presbyterian churches would pool their money together. The International Missions Conference was founded by all sorts of different denominations that said, look, you've already sent your Baptist missionary to India, we've sent our Presbyterian missionary to India, and we've sent your Methodist missionary to India, and they are working together in India because they're the only Christians in that town. We should be working together and coordinating here, even back in England or wherever this is founded. So that's going to bridge now from talking about missionary to the ecumenical movement, which is one of the most important events that took place in the 20th century. Now, ecumenical movement is going to have some downsides to it, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment, but I'm going to start on the positive note. The ecumenical movement was born out of the missions movement. So what was the International Missions Conference continued to function, where missionaries from different denominations would coordinate their efforts. And they said, look, we work together so well, we ought to form a group called the Faith and Works Commission, Faith and Life Commission. Sorry, that came first. Faith and Life Commission says, how can we do life both over there and coordinate our, not just missions over there, but our ministry here? And then later they founded what was called the Faith and Works Commission, I think that's the name of it, where we not only talk about how we do ministry together, missions together over there, and coordinate our ministry together here, what if we work on what we believe together over here? And this is the foundation of what will be called the World Council of Churches, when these groups all come together. Now, their goal, if the background is missions, their stated goal is to be a united witness. So I'll give you a few key Bible verses here. Jesus told his disciples, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, that you have the right doctrine. Oh no, that's not what it says. By this all will know that you are my disciples, that you do the right missionary methods. No, that's not what it says either. Or that you have the right form of church government. You're a Baptist instead of Presbyterian, or you're Methodist instead of... No, it's none of those things. By what will all men know that you are my disciples? By the fact that you love one another. And Jesus prays in John 17 that all of them, talking about his disciples, he's praying to his Father, all of them may be one, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that, this so that is important, so that the world will believe that you have sent me. So according to Jesus, for the world to really believe, then all disciples must be one, as Jesus says in John 17:21. So the ecumenical movement was born out of this desire to have a united Christian witness. Let me give you just a couple of quotes to go along with this. John Wesley famously said, "Would to God that all party names," that means denominational names, "and unscriptural phrases and forms which have divided the Christian world were forgotten. I should rejoice if the very name," and he's talking about Methodist name, "the very name Methodist might never be mentioned more, but be buried in oblivion." So what John Wesley wanted was not a new Methodist church. He wanted a Christian church on witness for Christ. We could also talk about another. We'll go to a Baptist, since that's who we are here. Charles Spurgeon. We don't have a John Wesley or someone like that we're founded after. Spurgeon's the closest thing we have. And Spurgeon even said, "I say of the Baptist name, let it perish, but let Christ's name last forever. I look forward with pleasure to the day when there will not be a Baptist living." Now, Spurgeon doesn't want all of you Baptists to die. He wants the name Baptist. You're not going to call yourself a Baptist. You're going to call yourself a Christian. Well, we are Baptists. That's okay. But the ecumenical movement is the idea that we should care more about our being Christian than about our denominational names. And we should especially care about that as we work together for the goal of Christian witness. Now, the World Council of Churches was, I'll give you one more quote. Sorry, I forgot about this. A famous motto in the ecumenical movement is where we talk about three things. In essentials, something's trying to wake up here. Hold on. There we go. In essentials, unity. So when it comes to belief in Jesus, we should be united. In belief in the doctrine of the Trinity, whatever our essentials are, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. So if you believe that you believe in post-tribulation millennialism, and I believe in mid-tribulation millennialism, and someone else believes in pre-tribulation, pre-millennialism, can't we all just get along? You see, don't you have the right to believe these different, aren't these non-essentials? That's the sort of idea. But in all things, charity, love, however we're going to carry this out. Now, that sounds good in theory. I think we could all say, yes, we should love one another. By this, the world will know. The World Council of Churches meets every 7 years, gathering all churches who will agree to participate in this. And the vast, vast majority of denominations do participate in this for a while. And I think it was in one of the 1970s meetings. I should double check the date. This shifted from being interdenominational to being interreligious. So we weren't just being ecumenical, meaning you can be Methodist, I can be Baptist. We said we should just be nice and all work together as best we can, even if I'm Christian and you're Jewish and they're Hindu and they're Buddhist. And so in one of the 1970s meetings, a shaman from one of the Eastern ancestry religions was invited to give the invocation, the opening prayer, and this person prayed to the spirits, plural, of earth, air, wind, and fire. Not the disco band. The elements. And so at this point, most evangelicals pulled out and said, this is not Christian witness anymore. So that's fine. You can be nice to other religions, but this is not a council of churches, and the World Council of Churches became suspect. And again, there's valid criticism of what happened in this movement where we say we're so worried about missions and working together, we're not going to talk about what we believe, and it became criticized as being thin ecumenism as opposed to thick one of conviction. So what's going to happen in the future of this? It's hard to know. I would point out for you that even the National Association of Evangelicals was caught up as part of this movement. Many evangelicals originally were a part of the World Council of Churches. Before evangelicals left, they also formed their own National Association of Evangelicals. And notice, to be a part of this movement, and I'm going to talk about evangelicalism next, you don't have to just be Baptist or just be Methodist or just be Presbyterian. Can't we find ways where we can work together? So again, there's a bridge. Let me talk now about evangelicalism. I may have said this earlier. I grew up here at Calvary. I knew nothing else of church life in any way, shape, or form until I went to college at Samford University and then seminary, and everyone kept calling me an evangelical. And I didn't even know I was an evangelical. I didn't know what that meant, but I guess I am. That's fine. And this is one of the problems we're going to deal with is what does it mean to be evangelical? This cover of Time magazine is from 1977. The Evangelicals' New Empire of Faith. The Time magazine and most of the news media around the country were shocked to realize how powerful the evangelicals were because the evangelicals had all just voted in droves for who? 1977? Jimmy Carter. Because Jimmy Carter said he's a born-again Christian. And all the media mocked this as well. If somebody's going to talk about being a born-again Christian as one of those fundamentalists, they'll never be president. And many evangelicals did vote for him. And then later, I'm blanking on his name, the founder of Liberty University, Falwell, thank you, is going to found the Moral Majority, and the evangelicals will start to vote, especially pro-life candidates, and suddenly the evangelical vote matters. And people in the news media had to figure out from 1977 on, who are these evangelicals? It started long before 1977, long before Jimmy Carter. I'll give you two key ideas as part of the background. First is Protestant liberalism. And now these words are always difficult, right? When I say someone's liberal, what I mean is they're more liberal than me. And when I say someone's a fundamentalist, I mean they're more conservative than me, right? No one calls themselves a liberal and no one calls themselves a fundamentalist. But there is a true capital L liberal movement that was born in earlier Protestantism. I don't have time to go into. It's largely coming out of the German school universities where they're studying the Bible, not as inspired text, but as ancient text from history. So this is not doing theology for what we believe. This is ancient history that you're studying. So when you read the Old Testament, according to that first background, Protestant liberalism, well, of course, the Old Testament God looks like an angry desert God. They were Bronze Age people. You can't blame them for thinking in those Bronze Age terms. And Adolf von Harnack was the foremost church historian in the world at that time, and he thought Marcion, remember what did Marcion get rid of? Remember that heretic? It was the very first session this morning. Got rid of the Old Testament. Harnack said Marcion was right. We should get rid of the Old Testament because it's ancient history. We don't need that anymore as modern enlightened Christians. And that's an extreme example. Most people from the liberal movement in Germany didn't follow that. But in reaction to that kind of extreme historical take on the scriptures, you had another shift. You had American fundamentalism. And again, no one wants to call themselves a fundamentalist, except around 1910 to 1915, there was a group who called themselves the fundamentalists because they believe in the fundamentals of the faith. And in response to that liberalism, they said, you need to really believe the core, the essentials of what it means to be Christian, fundamentals of what it means. So I've listed those for you there. Inerrancy of Scripture. This is not just ancient text. You should believe in the inspiration of Scripture. Virgin birth. Jesus is not just another prophet, not just another person who sounds like an enlightened individual teaching good morals. He is the Son of God. And substitutionary atonement. It's not just as if we try to be good people. Christ has to save us. Bodily resurrection, miracles. In liberal mentality, Jesus heals the demoniac. Sorry, that's in traditional reading. In liberal reading, he was someone who had schizophrenia or something like that. You see, they couldn't help but read it as demons because they were pre-enlightened people. So liberal movement doesn't believe that Jesus healed people of miracles. He just helped them relax. Okay? Fundamentalism says, if you don't believe in miracles, you don't believe in Christ. You don't believe in Christianity. This is fundamental to the faith. So far, so good. Next characteristic of by the way, I should have said, the fundamentals are a group of tracts written under this title and by people at phenomenal places like Princeton and key scholars. And then a very wealthy businessman paid for every minister in America, no matter what their denomination, to be mailed a copy of these tracts on the 5 fundamentals. So this became very widespread. So far, so good. Then you have three fundamentalist characteristics. And I'm taking this definition from the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, lest you think I'm being mean to the fundamentalists. This is someone else's view on this that's tried to define what fundamentalism is. And I think they're trying to be fair, but they're pointing out that the reason nobody likes to call themselves a fundamentalist is because along with the belief in the fundamentals went this mindset, these characteristics, retreatist. I've got a picture here for you. Can you make that out? This is a dear sweet fundamentalist mother to the left. They're skating, and she says, Junior, don't go near the thin ice. Can you see the thin ice? The way up at the top is modernism. Don't get anywhere near that sort of stuff. And the thin ice is new evangelicalism. So you see, don't even trust the evangelicals. You got to stay way, way, way away from modernism. I mentioned that some key scholars were at main universities, main schools like Princeton. The fundamentalists lost the debates. You could not find many evangelicals at Princeton. You can't find any at Princeton University, more than likely, teaching in the School of Religion. We lost those debates. And so we pulled back and founded many of our own schools. You see, retreatist. Don't go out there and learn from the liberals. Retreat and found our own places. Now, I'm not trying to be critical. I teach at a Christian university. I teach at a private school. I grew up in a private school. It's all I've ever known. But you see, this characteristic could go too far. If the modernists are bad, who else is bad? Other Christians are bad, and we just keep retreating, and this becomes a characteristic of fundamentalism. Another characteristic is this exclusivism. This will become apparent when we talk about Billy Graham and the evangelical movement. Billy Graham belongs to what denomination? I bet y'all know. Southern Baptist. There we go. I used to ask that in Seattle when I taught there. I used to pull out a $10 bill. Who can name for me? I'd have a class of 40 students. How many of you can name what denomination Billy Graham belongs to? And no one ever got it right. And when I told them Southern Baptist, they did not believe me. No, he couldn't be Southern Baptist. You know, they're from the left coast. We could not believe that Billy Graham would belong to that group. That's because Billy Graham didn't trumpet being Baptist and only work with Baptists. He infuriated a lot of the group that we would call fundamentalists because he was willing to work with Methodists and Presbyterians and all sorts of other groups. He was not exclusivist. You see, he was willing to cooperate and work more ecumenically. But fundamentalist groups were very upset with Billy Graham at first. It wasn't until his great, great success later that the tide started to turn. So you see, they're exclusivists. They don't want to work with others. And again, this is not entirely fair, but you have this characteristic. We know what's right. They don't, so we exclude them. Finally, anti-intellectual. Again, this is entirely unfair, we know, but the idea is don't go to Princeton and study with those liberals. In fact, don't even read what they're writing. You don't want to be infected by their liberal ideas, and don't read anything that the scientists are writing or that any of the public intellect. You see, we are anti-intellectual. Now, again, that's not fair to any one fundamentalist, but as a movement, I mentioned at the beginning, the reason I like Mark Noll's book is because his work writ large has been so important. His other book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, talks about this, that evangelicals had this idea that said you don't need to study, you don't need to work, you don't need to try to serve the Lord with all your mind. It was pietism. Just use your heart. Turn off your brain. Now, no one person said that. I know this is not fair, but this is the type of characteristic. Many of you will remember Jay Call. He grew up here. He's pastoring in Macon now, and he tells a great story about how he was at a family reunion, and some distant cousin, I don't know who this was, but asked Jake about what he was studying, and he said, oh, this semester I'm learning Hebrew. And he said, why do you need to study Hebrew? They got it in English. It's called the King James. Well, that's true. We can read the King James, and we can also study, you see, to show ourselves approved. All right, so if we're not going to be fundamentalists, let's talk about evangelical characteristics. David Bebbington has a book called Evangelicalism in Modern Britain. He gives 4 characteristics. I need to go quickly through these so I save time for my other material. But basically, we're talking now about conversionism. So I talked about revivalism. That's still influencing us, and this is a good thing. We want to be calling for converts. And Biblicism. So we believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. We believe in the infallibility of the Bible. We believe that if the Bible doesn't say it, you see, something's suspect here. We have to be centered in God's Word and centered in crucicentrism, centered in the cross of Christ. Yeah, I hope my seminary students know that if you're preaching on the Old Testament, that's great, but you better get to the cross. Right? You haven't gotten to the cross, you haven't done your job. In fact, don't stop there. We get to the resurrection as well. So if we're not rooting everything we do in the cross of Jesus Christ, something is suspect to us evangelicals. And then activism is the last one. So we may march for pro-life, we may raise money for orphanages, we may be in part of all sorts of activist groups, both politically and otherwise. So these are 4 characteristics of evangelicals. Notice if I go back through those, evangelicals are basically those Christians who hold to the fundamentals without fundamentalist characteristics. You have evangelical characteristics like these. Now, to give you some very specific examples of this, I already mentioned Billy Graham. Billy Graham upset a lot of people until we realized just how wonderful Billy Graham is, and now no one could question Billy Graham. If you like Billy Graham, that probably means you're an evangelical. What does it mean to be an evangelical? It's still a big debate. At least we all agree on him, right? Another one is the magazine Christianity Today, and that's not quite as important anymore. I'm just curious, how many of you subscribe to the magazine Christianity Today? One. All right. Well, that's not surprising anymore. There was a day and time, especially in the the middle of the century, where evangelical Christians knew what it means to be evangelical by subscribing to Christianity Today. How else are you going to know when the next Promise Keepers rally is, or whatever it is you're going to? You subscribe to this magazine. Well, now we've had the new Gutenberg event, right? And the internet means we don't need any one magazine to define us, but that also means if we don't have any one source defining us, evangelicals have become a very, very broad thing today. So who is an evangelical today? It depends on who you ask. We're seeing more and more that evangelicals are not just one solitary group. For example, are Pentecostals evangelical? Probably. At least when the news media talks about evangelicals, they're including the Pentecostals, but it depends. Here's another question. Are denominations who come from the historic black tradition, black churches, are they evangelical? When the news media talks about the voting bloc, they're not talking about black Christians, from Black Baptist Christians, Black AME Christians, Black Methodist Christians. They're not talking about them, even though all the characteristics I just described for you would define them. But you see, this has become both a theological category, evangelicalism, and a political category, the evangelical vote. And so this is very, very hard to define today. That's why it was a good thing I didn't know if I was evangelical. Maybe we don't need this word anymore. I'm not sure. Okay, world Christianity. This is going to be our final point, this and the future of Christianity. When we talk about world Christianity, we should admit that the Christian religion has always been a world religion. I mean, so just take a quick glance at the map of the Mediterranean. If you can make out the purple, those are areas that we know had a Christian presence by the year 195. And even here, this is being a little too conservative. If you went to the year 210, 220, this purple would cover many more parts of the map. And the green are the parts that's known to be Christian by the year 325. And soon after that, it's going to spread far, far east and even further south, and etc. So from the time of Jesus, right, in the early first century, 2 centuries later, Christianity has already exploded on the scene and become a major world religion. And even in the centuries going into the Middle Ages, Christianity spread far and wide. Christianity never was simply a European religion. And everyone who's studied the history of Christianity knows this. Unfortunately, in the popular mind, we still always think of Christianity as a European, Western tradition, and then other religions were far out there in the East, and the two are only now encountering one another. This is not the case. When we talk about world Christianity, I'm going to talk about a few different groups here. First, black theology. Examples of this would be Frederick Douglass, Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King, and others. And when we talk about black theology, we are talking about theology coming out of the black experience, primarily in the United States. And we'll talk about other groups too, but in a moment. But there is an idea of a shared collective experience, being born out of a people who were in slavery, brought to this world not according to their own desires, and then in the Reconstruction era and then the Civil Rights era, there is a set of shared experiences that shape this kind of theology. Let me give you a quote here. This is a fairly lengthy quote, but I think it's worth reading. This is when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham. He was arrested for marching for civil rights. There were signs that said whites only in the stores, whites only bathrooms, whites only water fountains, and they were protesting, saying there should be equal access, equal rights. When he was in prison and arrested for doing this, to his great dismay, a handful of white ministers wrote to Martin Luther King and said, "Dear Dr. King, we agree with you on what you're doing, but we disagree with your methods. Why can't you just wait? Be patient. Let the law take care of itself." Here's his answer. "Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen the hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society," this quote goes on, "when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and you see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, 'Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?' When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait." Now, I use this as an example, a very acute example of two different groups, both Christian, both using the same Bible, both using the same Protestant sources, both predominantly Baptist, with a very different understanding of what's the right Christian thing to do. And that is because they were born out of two very different experiences, right? The black experience and all that comes with it. Now, this develops into a formal theology called a black theology of liberation later. James Cone wrote the book on this called A Theology of Liberation in 1968, A Black Theology of Liberation. Many other theologians would write in this where they're intentionally trying to take the black experience and say, how does this inform our Christianity? Just as white Christians have used their white experience to inform their Christianity, whether or not they realized it. Here's one of James' quotes, very provocative quote here. Let me read it for you. "For too long, Christ has been pictured as a blue-eyed honky." And we've all seen these pictures, right? The white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, the Jesus that looks like me. Everybody says I look like Jesus. Well, that's because whoever painted him looked more like me, right? So James Cone says, black theologians are right. We need to de-honkify Jesus and thus make him relevant to the black condition. So a black theology is an attempt to be explicitly black because too often our artwork and our theology has been implicitly white. Another form of world Christianity would be African Christianity writ large. What is this? It's along similar lines as I just said about black theology. One person put it this way: a Christianity that will be no longer imported or simply adapted, but authentically Christian. Authentically African. That's a big difference. So when missionaries took Christianity to Africa, I said already that they largely tried to civilize the Africans. So by Christianize them, we made them European, or look, that was one of the main goals, things that came along with that. And so there are many in Africa, African Christians who are saying, what would Christianity look like if African Christians didn't try to look European? Okay, so some of this is as simple as having indigenous leaders. Why is it that in so many denominations, missionaries were sent there, white missionaries? Churches grew there at rapid paces, and when it was time to establish a new minister there, they went and got another white European missionary and brought them there. And maybe that's needed because you still haven't had enough training for people who haven't gone to school and seminary, but after 100 years, there still were cases of this in Africa where the indigenous people were not entrusted with their own churches. There was a large, widespread outcry for indigenous leaders, and along with that went indigenous theology. And there's some things in there that happen in African theology that would make many of us uncomfortable. Can you syncretize Christianity with African religions? Prayers to ancestors. We Protestants would generally say no, but notice Gregory the Great, that pope who sent missionaries out to the Angles, right? He sent them as angels indeed. He sent them over there, and he baptized temples and made temples very, very Christian. And yet there probably was a lot of syncretism there. So for some forms of Christianity, this is something that they would appreciate. There may be a lot of question marks here as well. The other is African independent churches, and this is a very widespread, very diverse movement, but this is churches that are breaking from the old missionary organizations and societies, and they're becoming independent, and some of their forms of Christianity are vastly, vastly different than mainstream Christianity. And there's no one form of this, so I can't give you a good evaluation, but very common practices include things like exorcisms and casting out of demons and things like that they're seeing, very widespread. Okay, I have to move along very quickly here. Latin America, it would have a similar form of discovering its own expression of Christianity, especially when you talk about liberation theology. Now, here again is where it gets very controversial when you talk about liberation theology, because the earliest founders of Latin American liberation theology were explicitly, unapologetically Marxist. You see this picture of Jesus? Does that remind you of anyone? That's intentionally painting Jesus to look like Che Guevara. So, if you think Che Guevara is a murderer, then this is entirely unacceptable to you. If you think he's a freedom fighter, then you see this is what Jesus looked like to you. Jesus was out to help those who were being oppressed by the Romans. The key teaching here is the idea of the preferential option for the poor. That's a phrase that you'll hear over and over again. Not just God also loves the poor, preferential option for the poor. And if you read a lot of what Jesus has to say, Jesus has a lot to say about the least of these. Is it a preferential option? This is where liberation theology takes its start. Along with this, you could also talk about mestizaje, I think is how you pronounce that, or mestizo theology, and mestizo means mixture. In Mexican-American Christianity, there is a strong sense and explanation of how Mexican Americans are inevitably feel a sense of mixture. They're both Mexican and American. And in some ways, that makes them not really Mexican. Right? If they go back to Mexico, they'll say, you're not really Mexican, you're American. But if they stay here in America, they feel like they're not really American. You don't belong here. You're from Mexico. You're not really American. Well, so their sense of mixedness is informing their faith, after all. Which was Jesus, divine or human? So they believe that this awareness of being both and can also influence how they understand their faith. They're unashamedly, unapologetically willing to mix American expressions of Christianity with also their own forms of Mexican values and things that might go along with that. All right, Asian Christianity would follow along a very similar pattern. I have to admit, I have read very, very little in Asian Christianity, but there is a growing, huge, vast amount of literature coming out of this. I'll point you to a book by Simon Chan. It's called The Grassroots of Asian Christianity, and he believes that much of what you'll learn from Asian Christians, even though most of them became Christian because of Western European missionaries, is they have a unique form of Christianity. And if left to themselves, they will worship differently, they will talk differently as Christians, and we can learn from what that is. It's a grassroots coming up out of the soil of Asia. One of the things that we're hard-pressed to study today is to even find out the number of Christians in Asia, especially in places like China, because Christianity has been suppressed there for so long, and yet the more you look for Christians in China, the more you find. It is impossible to calculate the number of Christians in China. We think it is growing exponentially there, but it's an underground church. And so what's it going to look like when suddenly Christianity is given full rights and freedom in China? Who knows? Only God knows what that's going to look like. All right, so what is the future of Christianity going to be, given how much things are changing in this world? I've given you a few things on your handout, a few charts. I mean, if you look at the number of Christians per continent, you'll find some surprising things. You might think that the majority of Christians are in Europe and North America. This is no longer the case by any means. Africa is the most Christian continent. If you count Europe and Russia together, you might have more, but even then when you look at the percentages, Africa is the fastest growth by far. Exponential growth has taken place in Africa. We tend to think that we, Western North Atlantic people, need to send missionaries to Africa, and there is still great work that we can do and ministry we can do in partnership, but percentage-wise, there are more Christians in Africa than the percentage of Christians in America. If you want to look at the number of Christians per continent, I've given you this one as well. This is from Noel's own book. So if you want to go back to page 265 of the reading, he breaks down some of the details and what's going on here. But again, if you look at the percentage, where are the most of Christians? This is on page 12 of your handout. This comes down a lot to how you define Christianity. Is everyone who is born Roman Catholic in Latin America a true Christian? Evangelicals want to kind of refine that number. But even so, no matter what standard you use to define a Christian, you will see very similar percentages across the globe. Christianity has shifted from being centered in Europe, West America. It is now being dispersed around the world. One more chart I give you here, this global shift. If we were to think about Christianity in 1900, we would rightly think of Christianity being predominantly a white Western religion. If you think about Christianity today, that is no longer the case. And if you watch the trend into 2020 and into 2050, the shift is growing, continuing to go in that direction. Let me give you a long quote here by a guy named Philip Jenkins. He has a book called The Next Christendom, which tracks all of this. He says, "We are currently living through one of the transforming moments in the history of religion worldwide. The center of gravity in the Christian world has shifted southward to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Already today, the largest Christian communities on the planet are to be found in Africa and Latin America. If we want to think of a typical contemporary Christian, we should not think of a white Western European Christian. Instead, we should think of a woman living in a village in Nigeria or in a Brazilian favela." So what is the future face of Christianity? This ain't it. Okay? And what is the future of Christianity? I don't know, but it is becoming even more diverse religion. It is reaching into places we would never imagine. It is becoming all sorts of wonderful things that I think we can learn from. You've probably heard this idea that if you want to be a part of what God is doing, you look out there and see what God is doing, and then go get on board. And I think that's something that we Christians can certainly value and be a part of. I started off talking about Charlemagne, my son Charlie, who was here. Really proud of this heritage. Even more than that, I think we can be proud of our Christian heritage. Hopefully today we've gotten a glimpse back and looked at where Calvary comes from, where Baptist comes from, where evangelicalism comes from, where Protestantism comes from, and back and forth until we see hopefully a whole glimpse of what Hebrews calls a Christian cloud of witnesses, of all the saints both on earth and in heaven. This is a painting from the dome of the seminary I went to, and there you see around the dome 16 of the key leaders in all of Christian history. That goes back all the way to people like Augustine, and all the way to people, even William Seymour is up there, the founder of Pentecostalism. Because even if you agree or not with Pentecostalism, key movement in Christianity, as seminary students, we called them the Sweet 16, the 16 leaders there. But above the Sweet 16, you see many more saints and people who've gone before, Christians from history, and above them you see angels and archangels and all these faces gathered around, which to the right is the face of Christ with his hands out watching over us. I think this is the idea we see in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. If nothing else, even though we raced through a lot of material today, I hope you got a glimpse of that great cloud of witnesses that surround us, and I hope that's helpful to our own faith as we try to practice it today. Thank you all very much for being with me today, for sticking with all of this. Blessings on you for this evening.